Have you ever noticed how the fool, the clown, the jester, the trickster is everywhere? From Shakespearean plays to modern-day comedians, from ancient myths to political satire, fools seem to hold a strange and undeniable power. But why? Why do we laugh at them, yet often listen to them more than the so-called wise? And more importantly, could embracing our own inner fool make us wiser, freer, and happier? We live in a world obsessed with productivity, efficiency, and logic. We are told to be serious, to conform, to be mature. But something feels off, doesn't it? Take a look around. So many people are burnt out, disconnected, and uninspired. Workaholism is glorified. Creativity is stifled, and spontaneity is seen as irresponsible. Yet as Carl Jung, the legendary psychologist, pointed out, our unconscious mind craves balance. And when we ignore the fool within us, we become rigid, lifeless, and trapped in our own seriousness. The fool is not just a character in stories. It's a deep, universal archetype, something we all carry inside. It is the part of us that dares to play, question, and rebel against the status quo. And when we forget how to embrace this side of ourselves, life begins to feel empty. Shakespeare famously wrote, "The fool to think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." This paradox lies at the heart of human intelligence. Consider Socrates, the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece. His entire method of teaching was built on exposing the ignorance of so-called wise men. His greatest wisdom? The simple admission, "I know that I know nothing." This is the power of the fool. The fool questions what others accept without thinking. The fool laughs at things we take too seriously. The fool speaks truths that others are too afraid to say. Famous satirist Jonathan Swift put it bluntly, "When a true genius appears in the world, you may know him by this sign, that all the dunces are in confederacy against him." In other words, if society ridicules someone, there's a good chance they are onto something. Now, not all fools are innocent. Some are cunning. Some use their foolishness as a mask. Take the trickster archetype. Found in myths across every culture, Loki in Norse mythology, the coyote in Native American legends, Anansi the spider in African folklore. These figures aren't just foolish, they manipulate, deceive, and challenge authority. They expose hypocrisy, sometimes playfully, sometimes ruthlessly, and they do it with a smirk. They remind us of an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, deception is needed to expose a greater lie. The Joker in The Dark Knight put it perfectly. Introduce a little anarchy, upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. And sometimes that's exactly what is needed. Throughout history, the fool has had a sacred role, to speak the truths no one else dared to say. In royal courts, jesters were the only ones allowed to mock the king because their foolishness protected them. As long as they wrapped their criticisms in humor, they could say anything. Think about modern comedians like George Carlin, Dave Chappelle, or Ricky Gervais. They make us laugh, but they also make us think. They say things others wouldn't dare say, and in doing so, they force society to confront uncomfortable realities. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, once told a haunting story. A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the audience, but they thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will end, to general applause from wits who believe it's a joke. This is the burden of the fool sometimes. Their truth is ignored because people assume they are only playing, but being a fool is not always joyful. Psychologists have long studied what's known as the sad clown paradox. The idea that those who make us laugh the most often struggle the most internally. Take Robin Williams, a man who brought joy to millions yet battled depression behind the scenes. Or comedians like Richard Pryor, who used humor to mask deep personal pain. Psychologists suggest that humor can be a defense mechanism, a way to cope with suffering by laughing at it. As Friedrich Nietzsche put it, man alone suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter. So, what can we learn from the fool? First, don't take yourself too seriously. The moment you lose your ability to laugh at yourself, you become trapped in your own ego. Second, question everything. Just because something is accepted as normal doesn't mean it's right. As Mark Twain said, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. And third, embrace your inner fool. Life is absurd, the world is chaotic, Sometimes the best thing you can do is laugh at it all, because as William Blake wrote, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. We all begin as the young fool, naive to the hardships of life. But it is through mistakes, suffering, and most importantly, curiosity that we transition into wisdom. Yet, if we let go of our inner fool completely, if we become rigid, serious, and fearful of asking questions, we risk becoming stagnant. Like the wounded king, the fool has always been a paradoxical figure, both powerless and powerful. Historically, jesters were the only ones allowed to mock rulers without facing execution. They were protected by their apparent foolishness. But was this truly foolish? Or was it a form of strategic wisdom? The philosopher Michel Foucault suggested that society often silences uncomfortable truths by dismissing those who speak them as mad or foolish. This is why throughout history the fool has been both ridiculed and revered. From Socrates, who claimed to know nothing yet exposed the ignorance of others, to modern-day comedians, fools have always held up a mirror to society. In today's world, comedians, satirists, and social critics play the role of the fool. They make us laugh, but they also expose hypocrisy, corruption, and absurdity. George Carlin, for example, used humor to critique politics, consumerism, and social norms, making harsh truths easier to digest. The same goes for figures like Jon Stewart and Ricky Gervais, who, like medieval jesters, disguise sharp social commentary in comedy. The fool is not to be confused with the trickster. While both challenge authority and disrupt the status quo, their intentions differ. The fool is genuinely naive. He stumbles into truth by accident, revealing wisdom through his innocence. The trickster, on the other hand, knows exactly what he's doing. He bends the rules, deceives, and manipulates, often for his own amusement. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, identified the trickster as an essential archetype of transformation. Tricksters like Loki in Norse mythology or the Native American coyote spirit cause chaos that ultimately leads to new understanding. In this way, both the fool and the trickster are necessary forces for growth. Interestingly, many spiritual traditions embrace the fool as a figure of enlightenment. In Sufi poetry, the wise fool often appears as a wandering mystic who speaks in riddles, baffling the learned but delighting the pure-hearted. In Christianity, the concept of the holy fool is well documented. Saints like Saint Francis of Assisi rejected material wealth, living in joyful simplicity and embracing ridicule. In Russian Orthodox Christianity, Yurodivy, holy fools deliberately acted insane to challenge societal corruption and hypocrisy. Even in Zen Buddhism, enlightenment often comes through absurdity. Zen masters use paradoxical riddles, koans, to jolt students out of their rigid thinking. One famous koan asks, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" The question itself is nonsensical, but in contemplating it, the student is forced into a new level of awareness. In an age of hyperproductivity and constant self-optimization, the fool is disappearing. Society rewards seriousness, ambition, and efficiency traits that leave little room for play, spontaneity, or self-mockery. Children naturally embody the fool, laughing, exploring, and asking endless questions. But as we grow older, we are taught to suppress these traits in favor of being mature and professional. We fear looking stupid, so we avoid risks. We prioritize being right over being curious, and in doing so, we lose a part of what makes us human. Psychologists have found that playfulness is essential for creativity, mental health, and even intelligence. Albert Einstein himself once said, "A person who never made a mistake never tried anything new." He understood that intellectual growth requires a willingness to be wrong, to be a fool. In a world driven by rigid ideologies, polarization, and the fear of being canceled for saying the wrong thing, we desperately need the fool. The fool reminds us to laugh at ourselves, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to embrace the uncertainty of life. So how can we bring the fool back into our lives? Don't be afraid to make a fool of yourself. Sing off-key, dance badly, tell a ridiculous joke. Life is too short to take yourself seriously all the time. Ask stupid questions often. The simplest questions are the most profound. Challenge assumptions. Be curious. Laugh at your own mistakes. Failure is inevitable, but suffering over it is optional. Find humor in your own shortcomings. Speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. The fool's greatest power is honesty. In a world of masks, dare to be real. The fool is not just a figure of comedy. He is a force of truth, transformation, and resilience. He reminds us that wisdom and folly are not opposites, but partners. To be truly wise, we must be willing to be fooled. So the next time you feel pressure to be perfect, remember this. The wisest people in history were often considered fools in their time.